welcome everyone. We might get started if everybody's ready. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar or online workshop. My name is Jess Gregory. I'm the Project Lead Vulnerability Policy and Engagement at the Commission, and I will introduce my co-hosts. I'll let them introduce themselves in a moment. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're all meeting on today. For us in Melbourne, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. First of all, thank you for making time for today's workshop. We appreciate just how busy it is for some people and just how intense this environment has been over the last 6 weeks. One thing we're really cognizant of is that, we're all, coming from a home environment, so it's completely fine if there are little people or pets that you need to attend to. For those of you who just heard, my cat made an appearance at the Commission meeting yesterday. We think it was the first cat at the Commission, so there you go. So yes, we appreciate that, if you need to get up and make a cup of tea or all those kinds of things, please feel free to do so. Just a few things in relation to the technology. Please make sure that your microphone is muted. I think Anne has now muted everyone's microphone. Great. If you can, we'd appreciate it if you could change your Zoom name in the background. So if you click on the participants button, and then your name will be on the right-hand column for me. If you right-click, oh no, there's a button actually. There's a more button, I think. Just to put the name of your organisation in your name as well, so that we know where everybody's coming from. That would be really great. Let me think, make sure I get everything. We'll be taking questions in the chat function throughout the time, so please feel free to use the chat function. If you have any technical issues or anything like that, please feel free to put them in there as well. We also have the raise hand function, so you can use that to ask a question if you'd like to. I think we've got, someone has raised a hand. It says Galaxy Tab A has raised a hand. Is that anybody? No? Okay, we might keep going. If there's a problem, just maybe send us a message. The raise hand is, I think, down the bottom of that participants bar, so please feel free to use that. We also recommend that you put into speaker view if you'd like to, or gallery view, depending on how it's operating, but speaker view means that you'll see the main speaker for the component of their talk. And we'll also be recording today's session, so just be mindful of that. We do encourage you to keep your camera on if you'd like to. It's really nice to see you all, and it helps us have that sort of face-to-face engagement. But also, if you want to make a cup of tea and turn your video off, that's completely fine as well. So shortly, we're going to hear from Marcus Crudden, who's the Director of Price Monitoring and Regulation, to start with today's workshop. Then we'll hear from our guest speakers, so please welcome Alison Macdonald and Julie Kuhn, and we're really grateful for them making time today. Then there'll be some engagement activities that we'll be doing throughout the workshop, so we'll give you some instructions about how to access those. Maybe just as a starting point, the website we're using is called menti.com, and Anne's going to put the information in the chat bar. So you might want to get your phone out or find a separate screen to do that at the same time. We'll be sharing that instruction on our Zoom, so we should be fine. I'd also now like to introduce my co-hosts. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. My colleagues Kat, Anne and Christy are on the line. We also have Lucy Weston, who's our fantastic manager. So yeah, Kat, Anne and Christy, we might just let you introduce yourselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Kat. I'm also project lead on the vulnerability policy and research that we're currently doing at the Commission. I work very closely with Jess as my co-project lead, and our work is really about, we've just actually moved into these roles recently, and our work is now about how we hear and incorporate the voices of consumers that are experiencing vulnerability into the work that the Commission does. This has become really pertinent in recent weeks. So we've been working pretty closely with the community sector to hear the voices of consumers and what they're experiencing right now. And this is a really awesome opportunity to continue doing that and talking to businesses to hear what they're seeing as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Kat. Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm really pleased that we have both energy and water here today. I've just left the water team and taken up a role in the energy team. So it's really nice to see my old friends from water, because I loved working with you and all the work we did together on family violence and other projects. So I just wanted to say that it's really pleasing that we're still able to support all businesses in these sectors with family violence, and how you're going about supporting your staff and your customers. So looking forward to doing that. And I'll hand over to Christy.
Hi everyone, my name is Cristina Abela. I'm a policy customer engagement advisor in the water division at the East. Alongside with Lucy, Marcus, and Anne, I was part of the team that developed the Commission's response to the Royal Commission into Family Violence. I then went into maternity leave, and I'm just back. I'm returning to this role, so I'm looking forward to re-engaging with everyone in this space that I'm sure is doing fantastic work in these circumstances. Really pleased to be here today.
Thanks, Christy. And as you know, I'm Jess, and I guess one of the things is, in each of our roles in different ways, we've been involved with the family violence work to date. And we thought this was a really poignant opportunity, given the environment that we're all living in, the things that we're hearing about what's happening in relation to family violence, to come together and to hear from experts about what's happening on the ground. So with that in mind, I'd just first like to welcome Marcus Credden, who's going to say a few words. I think you might be on mute, Marcus. There we go.
Thank you, Jess. Welcome to everybody that's joined us here today. I'm Marcus Credden. I'm the Director of Price Monitoring and Regulation at the Commission. For those of you that are in water probably do know and probably met me before, that I was quite involved with the original development of the family violence response, which started in the water team with Lucy and Christy. More recent times I probably had less involvement as it's shifted from water over to energy. So for the energy staff out there that haven't met me before, it's perhaps a nice chance to meet and be part of this work in a broader sense, that myself and the other executives of the Commission are very proud of the work that's been undertaken by the Commission in this area. So in welcoming you, I really welcome you on behalf of the Commissioners and the executive team, so Sarah and John Hamill as our CEO. We see this as very important work, and in this time of great upheaval, we see there's a real emphasis on continuing with this work and continuing to work across sectors, and to work with you and the welfare sector and family violence experts on delivering outcomes for Victorian consumers. So before we commence today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, which for here in Melbourne is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and any here with us today. I'd really like to thank our speakers for today, Alison Macdonald, CEO of Domestic Violence Victoria, and Julie Kuhn, the CEO of the Women's Information and Referral Exchange. Both Alison and Julie will offer us some very valuable insights into what the sector is seeing at this critical time, but also be available to assist with answering some of your questions and providing advice if you require. At this time of social isolation, we think it's especially important to listen to our expert partners as they provide us with unique insights about how the current environment is impacting on those affected by family violence. For instance, we've heard that indicators are pointing to a potential increase in family violence incidents. We know this is an issue that affects all of us, and now is an important time as ever to hear from our experts and colleagues within the sector to understand what is happening on the ground. I want to start by noting that the coronavirus pandemic has raised unprecedented challenges for everyone, both personally and professionally. We're living through a time of great uncertainty at the Commission and across the regulated industries we deal with in water, energy. We're grappling on how to best protect customers who are experiencing vulnerability, whether it's for the first time or from an existing situation that has been exacerbated in the current set of circumstances. It's also important to recognise our protections and our codes deal not just with customers and authorities, but also importantly the well-being of staff. And so we're here to discuss what this means for people affected by family violence, for our regulated sectors supporting customers, and for staff affected by family violence. I know actually in the water sector, I've spoken to some MDs recently, and they've noted they've actually kept their offices open during this time to allow some staff to be able to attend the office, because we know the office environment is often a safe space for some of those in family violence circumstances. So it is very important that our considerations of this are not just about consumers, but also the well-being of staff within the industry as well. And really hope this is a time when you are able to provide assistance to your colleagues who may be feeling isolated at this time. As many of you know, before the restrictions on movement commenced, we were due to host an event to acknowledge the work done so far across water and energy on family violence and to set the tone for the next stage of the Commission work. Unfortunately, we had to postpone that event at very short notice. As you're aware, Marcia Neve was due to speak to give her reflections on the essential work done by the Royal Commission into Family Violence and how that had played out in the 2 years since. Today, we'll provide you with information on the current context of what this means for businesses. I want to reiterate the role of businesses has not changed. We expect businesses to carry out their obligations under the codes, to recognise signs of family violence, to respond respectfully, and to refer customers to appropriate services when it's safe to do so. This also extends to obligations businesses have towards their staff affected by family violence. We continue to expect businesses to offer support to staff and to ensure they meet any new accessibility requirements arising out of the home isolation. I also want to acknowledge staff who are working from home, that there are new challenges and stresses to think about when assisting customers affected by family violence. Customer support is essential, but providing the support might also be emotionally and difficult for customer service staff, and this should be front of mind for businesses, and ensuring there is support for those that may suffer vicarious trauma. It is a difficult environment to work from home where you may be isolated from a lot of the day-to-day support that is normally there. So I'd ask you, thinking about your responses and behaviours around family violence, you think of the well-being of your staff and colleagues as well as those of your consumers. Look, our role in the regulator is to improve the systems that customers use to access their essential services. We've done this work as a largely collaborative process, and this has had fruitful outcomes, as seen across the sectors, and we continue to want to work together on this work. Today provides a really good opportunity to discuss how we can advance systems to support customers and staff, and continue to work together as a community to ensure that those affected by family violence have access to safe and appropriate support. With that, I'd really like to hand over to Anne, who will take you through how the rest of today will run. I'll be around for the duration of today's meeting, so if there's anything anyone wants to put to me as an executive of the Commission about how it's going, what additional work or any additional support we can provide to you, please feel free to get in touch with myself or one of the team. We really do want to continue working with you, but with that, I'll hand over to Anne Randalls to talk you through what today's session will look like.
Thank you, Marcus. Look, I've put the Menti details in the chat. I'll read them out for you. Some people have already started to answer, so I'm going to share my screen once I give them to you. So if you haven't used Menti before, it's really easy. Log in. It might be easier on a tablet or a phone, just so you can keep us running at the same time. It's menti.com. And the code, which I put up in our chat, is 374369. I'm going to share my screen and you'll see. So the question is, what sector are you from? Now, can everyone see? Jess, can you see that?
No.
No?
I
No.
can't see that.
No, I'm still seeing you, Anne.
Oh, thanks. It must be
It's
thrilling.
great.
Let me just go again because it looks as though, right, can you see that now?
No, that's a bugger.
It is a bloke. Let me see. Share, sorry, here it goes.
There we go.
So I've got 36 people have answered already. So far we've got more from the water sector. This is a bit like some sort of more exciting polling, but the good thing about Menti is that you can see the results coming up.
Feels like
as you speak.
A little race.
It is. If you haven't used it, I will admit we are using the freebie Menti, which does limit us a little bit, but it's a really easy digital platform to use, and it's a great way of using something if you're doing digital engagement to offer something else to the people involved. So we've got 51 involved. That's most people. So keep it coming. I feel like I'm running a telethon.
We're not going to ask you to sing, while we're waiting for responses, Anne.
Oh, hallelujah for that. If there's anyone having trouble with logging in, let us know. We'll see how we can help you. So it's great that we've got so many people from the energy and water sector, though. That's really pleasing. 56, I think we've just got, if there's any, I'll leave it up just for a minute and we'll move on. So we can say we've got majority at this stage from the water sector. And of course, we know the water sector was instrumental in the first response that we did, the first work that we did. So it's lovely to see you all so enthused and still working very much in this space. So I'm going to stop sharing that at the moment. We are moving on to the next one. So the next question I'm leading you into Alison Macdonald's talk. It's a slightly more complicated question, so I'll just take you through it. We're asking 3 parts. So when you answer, so the question is, what challenges are you experiencing with A, customers affected by family violence, B, staff affected by family violence, or C, staff supporting staff assisting customers affected by family violence. Just going to ask you when you do answer that you put the letter before it. So I will share the screen. I will move to the next slide. And I think you can see the other questions when you hover. So I'm going to share my screen again. When I can, just find out which one I'm doing.
There we go.
I'm just trying to get that up.
You might just want to make that full screen there, Anne.
Okay. There we go. I'm trying to get, so if we can read out, if one of my colleagues can read out the full questions. There it goes.
Yeah.
So A, customers affected by family violence, B, staff affected by family violence, or C, those supporting staff assisting customers affected by family violence. So your frontline people, pretty much.
And I think, Anne, the question there was probably asking what kind of challenges you're experiencing too. So I think some people might have read it as which challenges.
Sorry. Well, I suppose it could be either, but yes.
It could be either. That's true. So I think we've got a couple of answers there. Do you want to read them out, Anne?
Yep. So we've got customers that are being affected by family violence. So that's obviously an issue. Customers are spending more time with perpetrators, and supporting staff. So if you can pass through some of these specific issues you're seeing either for staff, for customers, or for your frontline staff.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing their staff are taking difficult call after difficult call. I think that's a really important one that I think Julie might touch on a little bit in terms of how we support staff who are kind of working through these challenges.
Absolutely. And of course, working remotely, as Marcus mentioned in his introductory speech, it does make it a bit more difficult to get to those staff who are taking these calls, whereas once we know you'd be in the same sort of area and you can see when someone's upset because you're isolated, it's easy not to know what's happening, and that I'm sure poses enormous challenges.
Yeah, there's an interesting one there that someone said, a sharp increase in family violence calls being received inbound. So that's a really interesting insight into what's happening for a business.
So you can see different things, complexity between two parties when it comes to legal parameters, i.e. house titles, tenancy, power of attorney and AVOs. So and perhaps these are being highlighted more because of this issue of isolation. They would always exist, but this is exacerbating issues, I think, of family violence. We'll just give you another 30 seconds or so to put things up. Feel free to keep adding things. I won't close this off, but I will stop sharing the screen so that we can move on.
It's an interesting one there too, hard to take difficult calls with kids around. So where staff are working from home with kids present, I think that's a really interesting one.
And we recognise that at the beginning, that these are people's homes. We're not necessarily, you can't always, particularly if you've got really young kids, separate, or if you're sharing the space with a partner who's also trying to work from home.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, I'm going to increase calls to men's referral service as well. Okay.
Thanks, Anne. I think that was a really useful way to just get ourselves thinking as we lead into our first speaker. So on that note, I'd like to introduce Alison Macdonald, who is the Acting CEO at Domestic Violence Victoria. And this Domestic Violence Victoria is the peak body for specialist family violence services in Victoria. And it's an organisation I know very well because I came from DVV before I came to the Commission. So I'll just have a very short introduction. So please welcome Alison.
Thanks so much, Jess. So look, you've asked me to speak to a number of questions, and it was really interesting to see those topics come up in the online survey. I think I didn't come prepared to answer any of those questions, but perhaps Julie will talk to them. But so interesting to note that the roles of all of you as businesses in terms of supporting your staff are very similar to the work that we're doing with our member services, who are the frontline face-to-face family violence agencies, who are having similar issues with supporting staff working remotely, supporting staff who might be working with children around, for example, or who don't get the normal kind of opportunities for supervision and debriefing as you would in an office environment. So that's really interesting to see those trends. But look, Jess, I thought I might start with the question that a lot of people have been asking us over the last couple of months, which is whether the way we understand family violence has shifted because of the pandemic. And look, the answer really is that no, how we understand family violence hasn't changed. Family violence is when someone behaves abusively towards a family member. There's a pattern of behaviour that controls or dominates a person and causes them to fear for their own or their others' safety and well-being. We know that it doesn't take the form of a single incident. It's ongoing behaviour that gradually undermines a victim survivor's confidence and their ability to leave the violent person. Forms of family violence haven't changed either because of the pandemic. We know that it takes many forms, none of which are mutually exclusive. And while physical violence might be the most visible form, other forms such as sexual, emotional, social, spiritual, and economic abuse can be equally as harmful. But what we are particularly concerned about during this period, however, is that COVID-19 and the associated community containment measures are being weaponised, if you like, so by people who choose to use violence against their family members. And the pandemic's being used to justify abusive and controlling behaviours. So we know that since the pandemic hit, there's been an intense focus on family violence. I think we've seen a lot of that through the media commentary. And there's been a lot of scrutiny of what we can expect to see here. It's been interesting for us because we can look to learn from the experience of other countries and other jurisdictions who may have been like a few weeks or months ahead of us in terms of community transmission of the virus and community containment measures, and have seen different kinds of patterns emerge. We've been aware that other countries have been reporting really significant increases in reported family and domestic violence, and an increase in risk and severity too. We haven't necessarily seen that same trajectory in terms of the formal data measures that we have in Victoria, or at least not yet. But we're still really concerned about what some of the trends are telling us. So, look, we know from international evidence on natural disasters that there are spikes in family violence and in violence against women more broadly in post-emergency contexts. So we know this from Australia's experience with bushfires, with floods, with cyclones, and it's a pattern that we have a lot of international evidence about as well in other kinds of post-disaster contexts. What we're hearing from our member services, and they are the face-to-face agencies that work with victim survivors in the community, is that there has been an increase in the onset and severity of family violence. And we're really keeping a close eye on the trends that are emerging in terms of perpetration. So I thought I might just talk through some of that anecdotal evidence that is that we're keeping abreast of. So, for example, we know that isolating someone from family and friends is a very common tactic in family violence. And we believe that the social isolation measures that are in place at the moment are providing perpetrators of family violence with more opportunities to force victim survivors to isolate from their friends, from their families, community support networks, or indeed from the support of their workplaces if they have lost their employment due to the pandemic, or even if they're just working remotely. We know that stalking and surveillance of victim survivors through technology is an almost ubiquitous feature of family violence now, and where people who are in social isolation with perpetrators, we're seeing that there are increasing opportunities to control and monitor their movements and their communications through mobile phones or through other geolocating technologies, for example. We're hearing about tightening controls over finance and an increase in financial abuse. But we're also hearing about explicit threats of spreading or deliberately contracting the virus to exert control. So we've heard about threats to expose children to COVID-19, inviting people into the home and then saying they have COVID-19 as a threatening tactic, taking children who might be under family law, parenting orders, refusing to return them because on the grounds that they've been exposed to COVID-19, telling victim survivors that they're not allowed to leave the house for any reason. So we're hearing lots of evidence like that. We know that there's an increase through this period in migration-related abuse, and so this is also very common in family violence, where threats of deportation for people in Australia without permanent residency are used to keep victim survivors from seeking support. It often includes the threat of child removal as well. And we know that some of the most vulnerable victim survivors are women without permanent residency living with family violence, and that this pandemic has made their situations all the more precarious. Just in terms, a lot of people ask us what we are likely to see coming next, and of course, you know, the world has never seen the likes of a global pandemic like this. I mean, we've got the evidence I spoke about before about natural disasters, but we don't know a lot about what happens in a crisis situation that happens over a long period of time. I think we're really concerned about the impact that it will have on the most marginalised and disadvantaged communities as we move into recovery, and particularly what this will mean for the prevalence of family violence. I think this is especially concerning in relation to the gendered impact of the pandemic, where the predictions are that women will bear a disproportionate burden of the economic impact. But of course, because family violence is overwhelmingly an issue, it's not exclusively, but it's overwhelmingly perpetrated by men against women and children, we're very, very worried about what we predict might be a post-COVID surge in family violence as well. Jess, you asked me to talk a little bit about kind of what we're seeing in terms of what we're hearing from victim survivors themselves. I think in the early weeks of social isolation, we had actually seen a dip in decrease in demand on services, which was really concerning because if it did indicate, as we suspected that it did, that victim survivors had any opportunity to contact services diminished or curtailed because they might be at home with someone, effectively they might be trapped at home with someone causing them harm, that was really concerning. But we have seen those patterns level out more recently to pre-pandemic levels, but there'll likely be more further movement in the data. It's telling us quite an interesting thing at the moment. But we are certainly hearing is that through police, through courts, but through allied sectors that we work with closely, say mental health, drug and alcohol, child, youth and family services, for example, the multicultural sector in particular, they are a lot of those allied sectors are identifying warning signs of family violence to a much higher degree than they were pre-pandemic. And that kind of that tells us something about the ways that people are reaching out and seeking support and the kinds of engagements that they're having with those workforces that they do remain in contact with. In terms of the issues that are coming from that we're hearing from our services about from victim survivors themselves, there's a significant increase in anxiety and fear. I think increase in suicide ideation, a lot of anger from callers, a lot of increased requests for financial and practical support with safe technology, requests to help navigate Centrelink, for example. A lot of support required to access interpreters, which is a bit affected by the pandemic at the moment. I think, interestingly, we're also hearing that some victim survivors are reporting feeling safer, actually, as community containment measures may mean that it's keeping perpetrators away. The one thing we're really noticing is there's been a significant increase in contacts from family members and friends who are concerned about adults and children who might be at risk. Really concerningly, we understand there's an increase as well in calls concerning elder abuse and adolescent use of family violence against family members, and forms of family violence other than violence in intimate partner relationships, although that remains very high. We've been a little bit concerned by some of the narrative in the media, particularly early on, that indicated that access to the service system had been curtailed by the pandemic. So we've been working really hard to make sure that the public messaging reinforces that people can still contact services, can still contact the police, can still access the courts, for example. But we're very mindful that the places that people seek support, as I mentioned earlier, may have shifted because of the pandemic. And so we're now really looking to focus our attention on the whole range of frontline workforces that, such as chemists, supermarket workers, taxi drivers, GPs and health workers, for example, about providing them with information and resources to know how to recognise the warning signs, what to say, where to refer, for example. And I think that your workforces will also be key frontline contact points as well. Sorry, I'm just having a look at what you asked me to speak about. Jess, you wanted me to speak a little bit about the family violence service system itself and the shifts that it has made due to the pandemic. So my organisation, DVVIC, is the peak for family violence services. So our members are all the face-to-face service delivery organisations across Victoria who provide crisis and case management support, accommodation and refuge. The services providing information, resources, counselling and other therapeutic supports, for example. So our focus as the peak body has been squarely since the start of the pandemic, supporting the family violence sector to swiftly adapt to the pandemic. So I guess the kind of key messages are that all specialist family violence services across Victoria remain open and operational. Most of them have transitioned to remote service delivery and have service delivery continuity plans in place. The modes of service delivery have changed. So there's significantly reduced face-to-face and outreach work, as you would expect, but they are all providing work, providing their services across the telephone or on online platforms, and have increased their capacity to do collaborative work and secondary consultation. Some services are still providing skeleton staff, say in the courts or in offices, to respond to some level of walk-in demand as well. In some cases, we're hearing that the remote working environment is actually means that staff have more time to engage with victim survivors, which is a really interesting outcome of the way that we've shifted our work in this environment. But our message, I guess, is to all victim survivors, to family, friends, but also to other professionals, is that the specialist system is open, it's available for support and advice for anyone experiencing family violence or anyone who's worried about how the self-isolation will impact on their safety and well-being. Just before I finish up, Jess wanted me to talk very briefly, and I think Julie will talk about this further too, about just the role of business, particularly in terms of identifying warning signs, of responding appropriately and providing referrals. And I guess it's important to remember, of course, that with increased financial hardship facing households, and that being compounded by forced isolation, it can lead to more frequent, more severe family violence. So that's something that all of you who work in the work with people experiencing financial hardship will be aware of. And as I mentioned before, in many ways, essential and public services and private businesses have become part of the new front line of those workforces that are identifying and responding to family violence during the pandemic. And I think going back to what I mentioned before about the collaborative work that we're trying to do with other sectors is we're very aware that victim survivors may have their activities and their communications monitored in terms of contacting specialist family violence support services, but they may still be able to or allowed to contact businesses and other services more freely during social restrictions. So we're really looking at the opportunities we can have there to do some good collaborative work, because it's important to remember that staff and companies don't do this work, or aren't expected to do this work alone, or to become specialists. But it's about building those opportunities and to build on the excellent work that's already commenced, particularly out of the Royal Commission in Victoria, to articulate the role that in particular the essential services sector has in enhancing responses to victim survivors, and that, of course, predated the pandemic and will extend beyond the pandemic as well. Jess, did you want me to continue there? Is there anything else you'd like me to speak about particularly, or do you want me to hand over now?
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, I think maybe that's a good spot to have just a little reflection and kind of open up that opportunity for questions. So if you have any questions for Alison, feel free to put them in the chat bar, or to raise your hand. I'm still figuring out that functionality. But I really appreciate that, Ali. I think there was a lot in there, and a lot about, I guess, the complexity of the COVID-19 environment and how that's really impacting on the dynamics of family violence, the same tactics of power and control, but kind of being exerted in new ways. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. One of the things that really resonated with me was the point about migrant and refugee communities, and we've got a regular community roundtable with a range of community sector organisations that we're meeting regularly with to hear from them, and I think they really reflected on, I guess, just the compounding vulnerabilities that particular cohort are experiencing, because they don't have as much access to sort of other forms of financial support and those sorts of things. So and that idea of migration being used as a form of abuse is one that's not always as talked about. So I think that's a really important point. One thing, Ali, I was just going to ask you to touch on briefly is that role of secondary consultation that services can provide. could you just touch a little bit on, I guess, what that might look like if, you know, if maybe someone from a business was maybe calling to do to get some secondary consultation advice?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some really interesting models that you can look at where you might kind of develop partnerships, for example, with a local family violence service delivery agency where you can you know, you can call upon those specialist services and ask them for, you know, in kind of in the way that you would in terms of a referral arrangement as well, but where you're able to kind of seek their support for the conversations that you're having, where you're aware that there is family violence with a particular customer. That might be just in the form of kind of, you know, tips and for how you go about having a tricky conversation with someone who might be at risk. It can be about some of the more practical measures that you might want to be able to kind of learn about and be able to convey to those customers in particular. We do know, you know, it's really important because we do know that there are really significant barriers for people in reaching out and contacting support services, and we know that a lot of people will choose not to. A lot of people will choose not to because they fear that it's not safe to do so in their particular situation. But also people will prefer to have direct contact with the services that they know. And so I think you know, if there are also interesting models, I think, where you know, that agencies are looking at through the pandemic period in particular, where they have opportunities if warning signs are identified to actually set up either three-way calls or video conferences where support workers might be able to kind of bring in a specialist worker who can do some work around family violence risk assessment and safety planning at the same time as you're having engagement with that client, perhaps. So I think there's some interesting models that are being developed. Some of those have been expedited because of the pandemic period and because of the higher reliance on telephone and online-based work. Yeah, they're all the things that we kind of really encourage people to have a look at.
And I think that's some really interesting ways where that's happening across different health sectors and allied services and things. So these are sort of models that are being, as you said, tested out in these environments. I've just noticed a question from Lucy in our chat bar. Well, Lucy, actually, maybe I'll throw to you. Do you want to ask that question?
Yeah, certainly, Alison. Just we have been hearing about an increased number of neighbours reporting family violence. You alluded it to a little bit before, but I guess I'm just sort of wondering you've got any reflections on how that affects a person's pattern of future engagement if it's happened through a third party rather than through their own activity.
Yeah, well, that's a really good that's a good question, Lucy. You know, I mean, we've certainly been trying to convey the message that in this time of increased social isolation, it's really time to activate a community-based response. You know, it's important for neighbours, for colleagues, for family and friends to reach out and see if people are okay. I mean, I know that people get very concerned. I mean, particularly in the context of neighbours, people do get very concerned about, you know, if they're worried about warning signs, is about contacting the police, for example. But there's a lot of research to say that that actually where women and where victim survivors have been at risk and somebody has stepped in, that it's been enormously helpful because it has taken the onus away from them on having to seek those and on those protective behaviours themselves. So I think, you know, there's a lot of focus on the role of, say, bystanders and people who do have the opportunity to intervene. And I think, you know, we do really encourage people to act on their concerns. You know, I know that people can be very that can be a very daunting thing. That can be a really concerning thing. But the overwhelming evidence is that people who are at risk will be grateful for that support.
Thanks, Ali. We've got one more question, and then we're going to have a very tiny break in between. But this is from Alan from PowerShop. And Alan, feel free to jump in here as well. His question is about online support services. So he said, with online support services being used more often than not right now, do you feel they've been effective in their assistance, a potential shift towards this form of service? Or has the coronavirus environment now highlighted more than ever that face-to-face assistance is crucial?
Thanks for that question. It's a really good one. And I meant to speak about it actually. So where I mentioned that we had seen a dip in telephone-based support for those services that do provide online mechanisms to get in touch with them, we have seen an increase, and that's being reported across a number of different service systems, and I think that that tells us something importantly about how people want to engage. I don't know whether it's generational or whether it has arisen because of the pandemic context, but we are certainly seeing more levels of online engagement. I think there's a very rapid shift, obviously, because of the pandemic, to develop those online capabilities. And I know Julie will be able to speak to this probably better than I can. I think you know, and we really want to, if that's what people are asking for, we really want to be able to provide those opportunities. And I think we don't want to get to a situation where we you know, never return to face-to-face work, because, you know, in lots of ways there's no replacement for that that human-facing work, of course. So, but I think you know, it's an interesting trend that's coming, that has been really expedited, of course, by COVID, is that you know, a lot of agencies have kind of rapidly developed their capability to engage online, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens in the recovery period.
And I think
sorry, you can probably hear my kettle in the background.
Julie, I think you wanted to add something in there.
I just wanted to say that it's not either or. In the research that WIRE has done, where we've talked to victim survivors and said, how do you want to be contacted, or how do you want to reach out for support? They were fairly uniform that they wanted everything to be available, although they may only choose certain pathways in, and definitely one of those was having it available online. And knowing that people's circumstance may change, so what online may work at one particular time but may not work at another. The other thing I would say to keep in mind, and at WIRE we have web chat, and we spent considerable amount of time making sure we had a web chat which was safe at the user end, as in that there was no history that was being maintained on the user's device, whereas a lot of web chats are sales based, and they do capture that information. So I think you need that, and that information is stored on the device. So if you are having family violence conversations through web chat, I think it's really important that your organisation looks into the safety aspect. And if someone does make contact that way, have an open and transparent conversation where you're saying, just letting you know that this is information is being stored on your device. This is how you can get rid of it, or if you can't get rid of it, you may want to choose another way of continuing this conversation.
I think that's really good advice, Julie. And I just remembered that I think it was ANROS, the national research body, sent around some advice on sort of different forms of tech that were really useful for that sort of functionality. So maybe we'll try and share that around as part of the wrap up from today's webinar. Great. I'm also conscious of time, so and I'm terrible at keeping to time, so I'm trying to do my best here. So I did also want to acknowledge that we are covering some pretty heavy territory today, and I do try to do that at the beginning of these workshops, and I forgot, so I'm sorry about that. If you do need to take a minute or to speak to someone, there's always 1-800-RESPECT and those support lines, or if you need to take a break from the screen for today, please feel free to do so. It's pretty heavy territory, so we really appreciate that. And, you know, so please look after yourself and reach out to a friend if something's really resonating for you. What we did want to do was take a 1 minute break, which I really like the idea of. This was, I think, Anne and Christy's suggestion, just to stretch our legs. We are going to do one more, no, this is the second activity. There are 3 activities in total on Menti. So the code is the same for the moment. It's 374369. We're going to have a 1 minute break. We're going to come back. We'll have a look at those responses. And then Christy's going to run a quick activity before we get to Julie's talk. I'll set my watch. All right. Maybe we'll keep going at this stage. I think we're seeing a lot of answers come up on the screen. This is really excellent. So some of the key takeaways we're hearing: migration-related abuse, household tensions, financial abuse, the changing dynamics. Yeah, I think that's a really important one. Flexible services. Yeah, this is fantastic. I'll just give everyone maybe 10 more seconds to get back. We've just got something. Oh, that's all right. Okay, I'm seeing some really interesting takeaways here, but lots in terms of, I guess, the changing dynamics, what the response looks like, that knowledge and collaboration is really important. I feel like, so Anne's got to do a bit of tech changing here. So she's going to close her screen, and I am going to throw to Christy. He's going to take us through the next question before we get to Julie's talk. So Christy, if you're ready. No? Christy, are you ready?
Unmute.
Ah!
Oh.
Just wanted to make sure I wasn't talking to myself then.
That's it happens. No. Okay, so please can you go to menti.com again, and we're going to use the code 374369.
So we might just put that in the chat bar as well, shall we?
Yes.
It's a new code. It's 413191, and I'll just put that in the.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
In the chat.
Excellent. So the question that we're going to look at is, what challenges are your customer support staff experiencing?
And do you want me to share the screen, Christy, or
Yes,
wait for a minute?
please. Okay. So what challenges are your customer supporting staff experiencing? Longer phone calls, wanting to do more to help but not able to. Increased volumes of calls. Increased hardship conversations. Different way of having community online. But some of the stories are so sad, yes. It's heartbreaking indeed and emotionally draining. Increased hardship calls. And I'm glad, Jess, that you reminded us all to make sure that we look after ourselves in the same way that we're trying to support our staff and during these circumstances. Much longer calls, having an increased amount of difficult conversations, problem solving. Worry and stresses that they've said or done the right thing, of course. Okay, so I think these are really useful insights from you, which leads into our next speaker. Her name is Julie Kuhn. Most of you will know her. She is the CEO of WIRE, Women's Information Referral Exchange. WIRE provides free generalist information, support, and referrals Victoria-wide. It's run by women and non-binary people for women, non-binary and gender-diverse people. So Julie has been involved in our work to date. And for this session, she's going to discuss what it means as a workplace to support staff at this time. So welcome, Julie.
Thanks so much. I was given a few questions to answer, I'll sort of go through, and I thought it was a good starting point was maybe just talking a little bit about what WIRE's experience has been over the last 6 weeks, and then move on to secondary consults and talking a little bit about working with what you can do at your workplaces as well, because I think there's some common ground there. So just so in case people don't know, we have a telephone support line, and we're also providing web chat and email support. And unfortunately at this time we're not able to provide face-to-face support. I also just want to say with Alison here that we are members of Domestic Violence Victoria, and they're absolutely providing great support to WIRE and all other family violence services during this time. So thank you, Alison and Domestic Violence Victoria. But what we're seeing is our calls are remaining steady, but we've had an increased number of family violence. So WIRE receives calls on any issue, and usually that's around 40% family violence related. We're now seeing that closer to 60% of our calls. The other thing that we're seeing is that migrants and people with temporary visas are being more adversely affected. And just so you know, I'm talking about people that have been in Australia for 10 years, not people that just arrived just a year. These temporary visas affect a whole lot of people. The other people that are being impacted are those that are casual employees that basically lost their jobs overnight. And they have increased barriers because of being plunged into economic financial distress, of managing their safety around family violence. And I think that's really important to remember, that there's this multiplying effect. We're getting far more calls from professionals, friends and family calling on behalf of other people experiencing family violence. And one of the things I really have taken out of that is the kindness. And I think that's something we really should take on board, that we're seeing a lot of kindness of people extending themselves maybe in a way that they wouldn't usually in order to support someone else. So we're really wanting to lift people up that are doing that. What we're finding is that it's harder for people to find safe spaces to talk to us about the family violence they're experiencing. And usually that's because the person that is doing harm is in the same house and they've got limited opportunities to leave that house. We spent an hour on the phone with one person as they tried to find a safe space to speak that also had some confidentiality. So they ended up having to go to a park, but trying to be private enough, but not too private that they were unsafe in another realm as well. Again, what Alison has said is seeing that increased anxiety about will there be a support service there for them, and that's usually because the person that's doing harm has told them that no one is going to support them, no one is going to believe them, and there isn't a service delivery system out there. That has been, sort of other, the media did entrench that for a little while, although they seem to be
Rosie Campbell,
we are seeing
who has
more
all those
violence with housemates, adult children and teenagers. And we're actually seeing, I know this isn't family violence related, but it is interesting, we're seeing more violence from neighbours between neighbours as well. And I think that's all about close proximity, an increase in elder abuse of adult children returning to live home after they've lost their jobs and demanding money and demanding property and other assets. And increased calls from parents where partners are refusing to pay child support and all the things that Alison talked about beforehand. But where I wanted to move on to is really what Wire's been doing in that secondary consult space, because I think that's really important. And we see beyond a secondary consult is beyond just giving you information, and we want to make that available for professionals as well as friends and family, because there is an emotional load with providing that support. So there is, what support are you going to provide to the person that you've initially rung up about, but how can we support you to be there? Because you might be the only one that is being able to support that person. So we want you to be as strong as possible and to have the resources that you need to be able to do that. So what we've been doing at the moment is having Facebook posts and those sort of things on our website, encouraging people that are supporting others to give us a call, and appreciating that how hard it can be to be that person that receives that disclosure. And we are hearing that chemists and people that usually don't receive this information at the volume that they are now receiving it as in that COVID world of social isolation, where victim survivors are getting support where they can. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we're telling those people when they do ring up for a secondary consult. And the first thing we'll say is, you don't need to have the solution. Rarely does someone disclose expecting you to provide everything and the solution. And so to take that pressure off yourself, but you need to listen, you need to believe. You don't need to be a family violence professional in order to be supportive, but you need to have boundaries around your role. Don't say that you can fix things or you can do things that are not in your power. Be very clear about what you can do, but also be clear that you can make referrals to Wire, to 1-800-RESPECT, to financial counsellors and to other people that can pick up the portions of the asks that you are unable to assist with. Provide information that is accurate. If you don't know the answer, don't guess it. You might be able to say, if it's safe to do so, can I call you back? And do a safety check around that, because they will appreciate you not just second guessing what the answer may be. Let people know that they can leave their homes if they're in danger. As Alison said, COVID-19 has been weaponised by people that are doing harm to get that feeling that that person is more stuck and they've lost even more power and control. And I think the other thing is about being kind to yourself, that if you do everything I've just listed above, tell them if they're calling up your service, and you're able to tell them what policies and procedures they're able to use to improve their situation, if you're able to make referrals, if you've listened, if you've encouraged them and validated that they're strong and resilient, you have done an awful lot. You really have. It's no small thing that you have done, and you should be to recognise that, and your colleagues should recognise that as well. I would also encourage businesses to have information on their intranet. especially as not everyone can give us a call or give your service a call during your office hours. To have information easily accessible on your internet is really important. Then someone can get it when everyone's asleep at 2 o'clock in the morning, and have really accessible information about what your policies and procedures are around family violence, what that person can expect if they're wanting to give you a call the next day or the next week. The other thing I would say is be aware that things like elder abuse are increasing, and that if you see something and it's sus, ask a few exploratory questions. You don't need to come out and say, hey, are you experiencing elder abuse or financial abuse? But you can just ask a few questions. Can you tell me a little bit more about why this situation has changed so suddenly, or you seem very nervous about talking to your partner, but you don't need to go further than that. And the other thing I would say is that, and Alison has said about this as well, is that we are preparing for a surge in family violence disclosures when the social isolation restrictions end, and that is something that your businesses can start preparing for as well, and maybe talking to agencies about setting up those partnerships that Alison was talking about, so that you're really well supported. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to talk about is what you can do to support your employees, and I think that's really, really important. One of the things that we've done at Wire is we've had a personal conversation with each staff member, which has included many aspects of OH&S, you know, what chair have you got, those sort of things. But we've also talked about where is a good room for you to have conversations. Are there children in the house? Is the phone conversations you're going to be appropriate for children? Can you be distracted during those calls? And quite frankly, for the calls that Wire has, they can't be distracted with a child. So for us, we've made the decision that a person can only be working on the telephone response when they are able to not have children that they need to be responsible for. And that has meant we've had to readjust what some people's work to be able to do that. But I think it's really important. We've also looked at alternatives, such as you can come into the office and keep to your social isolation rules and come in there if that's a safe place. We have also asked about the family situation, or provided a space for people to talk about that. And I think one thing that's really important, if you're working in even a medium or small size organisation, the chances are you're working with people that are experiencing family violence. For some, and I think Marcus said this, the work may be their only safe place, but it may also be the only place that they feel not only safe, but feel good about. And the fact that the person that could be doing harm could be starting to criticise them about how they're doing their work would be a new dynamic for them. And they could lose something that's really precious. And so it might be a real time of fear for them for an increase and a change in how that emotional abuse is occurring in their home, another access point for them. The other thing that I would say is also presume that you probably have people working for you that are causing harm at home. And it's really important to have information on your intranet in which you're not only providing information and support for victim survivors, but making clear pathways for people that are doing harm, that they can call them men's referral service. And and there needs to be an acknowledgement of that as well. We need to deal with both sides of this. Make it really clear how staff can get hold of their manager or whoever is the appropriate person in your workplace if they're experiencing family violence. The other thing I would say, that if you're finding that a worker that's usually, does good work, suddenly when they've started working from home, for no reason that they've been able to communicate, their work performance has dropped off a lot. They seem to inexplicably be missing at certain times that they can't explain. Instead of going straight into a disciplinary procedure and pull your socks up conversation is maybe have a conversation of feeling out what is happening in your home. It may not be family violence, but it may be. It also may be other things. It may be that they're waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do 3 hours of work before they look after the kids between 9 and 3:30 when they're in school, and then they're starting their work again. And after doing 6 weeks of this, they're just plumb exhausted. And I think that's, and I know I've drifted off topic, which I told Jess if I was given free rein I might, but I think it's really important.
No, it's okay. Thank you, Debbie. You're doing great.
Acknowledge that it is women in our society, whether they like it or not, are given the role of being an unpaid carer. And so they are doing it hard during this pandemic. The amount of work that they're doing to not only support children, but to support older people and people with a disability that are struggling to get out and do things has grown exponentially, and the workplaces should be doing everything that they can to support that. Which I did want to just sort of end on is really talking about the impact on women and financial security. And I think there was a report that came out yesterday that's saying that more women have lost their jobs than men, but men have lost more income, which makes sense because men earn more to begin with. So women have less to lose, unfortunately. And we're seeing the impact of what happens when you have millions of people that are in the casual workplace lose their job and they have no buffer. And more women are casuals than men. More women are in part-time work than men. And when they lose that small amount of income that they have, they get plunged into financial distress overnight. So this could be happening for the people calling to your service. I would also say this could also be happening to some of your staff as well, and you need to be cognizant of that. And I just want to say the impact of that is extreme. We had a call from someone who called our service a couple of weeks ago. It was someone who was on a temporary visa. They had lost their work. They were unable to stay where they were, which was a place without a lease. They were told to leave. Her and her 6 children were now living in a garage with no heating, no nothing, and grateful that they had a friend that had a garage for them. And this is what has happened to a lot of women overnight that are calling your service. I know they are. I think when you had that graph up and people were saying that they're hearing very, very sad stories that they're having to deal with. And I suppose to just end, one of the things that we're doing is we're acknowledging that our staff are also hearing these really complex, sad stories as well. And they don't have the usual supports that they usually have. They can't have lunch with their mates and debrief and do those sort of things. So we are making sure that we're doing weekly individual check-ins, and we're having sort of remote virtual lunches and those sort of things just to keep an eye on how people are going and what the staff are telling me. And I can see it in my own self. It's a bit of a roller coaster ride where you're just on a high on how much you've been able to do and how well you've adapted, and at other times you just go, these stories are hard, I wish I could do more, and you go up and down, and it's really important that we try and support those people, our staff, as much as possible, as well as congratulate them for the resilience that they've had to be so adaptive to the change. And I'll just leave it there.
I think Christy might be having some challenges coming off mute.
So thank you. Did you see I was talking to myself? It was really interesting what I was saying, everyone. Julie, thank you so much for sharing all of these insights with us. I think even though some of them are hard to even conceive that it is happening. So it's really important for us to have these issues front of mind when we're responding, taking these calls and attending to our staff. I think on a positive note, I was really encouraged for you to say that you have also seen an increase in kindness, and it's not something that we are necessarily reflecting on so much because of all the negativity of all the, it's not negativity, but all the realities that are, you know, coming our way. And also, I guess, as a new mom, it was really good to hear how you are supporting or the changes you're providing to staff with children at home. Okay, so now we're gonna move to questions, and we have two questions now. We have one from Yarra Valley Water and then one from First Energy. So we're gonna go over to Samira for the question.
Thank you. So my question was just a little bit around communications. So at Yarra Valley Water, we've often gone through our community partners at financial counsellors, family violence caseworkers, emergency relief to kind of get the message out there about what our family violence supports are. But we know that people aren't able to contact these support agencies as easily at the moment. So considering safety always being the priority, do you have any sort of recommendations around how we might proactively promote our family violence supports to customers safely? You've mentioned website. We can't do things like send a brochure, a family violence brochure out to everyone. Obviously, that's far too overt. Do you have any sort of advice on that front?
Sending out a brochure is maybe too overt. But when you send out an account statement, you might have something small that's on it that goes, so it doesn't look like you're targeting anyone, it's just gone out to everyone. That's something that I've seen, and I know in the water industry you get those little messages about this is how much water you're using, and that, so it is something just having there as a regular. I think still try and get out to your partners. We have got someone working 2 days a week just updating our referral pathways because we're in a changing environment. So if you got that information to us, we would be changing our referral pathways if you've got a change of things and then putting that in. Maybe not all services are doing that, but I think it's still important to try and use your conventional ones. And even probably reaching out to maybe services you haven't reached out to before. Whether it was possible, and I think the other problem to take into account that some people have now been swamped with information, but could you get something out to ethnic community councils, Victoria, that they could send out to their services? That might be a way to go. If you sent something out to, if there was something from the Essential Services Commission that went out to Domestic Violence Victoria, I'm saying something, Alison can probably go, don't say that, Julie, but that if you sent something out to the peaks that said, can you communicate this? This is what utility companies and the water industry is doing. There are other really great ways of getting those messages out, and those services can get it out in their usual communications to their members.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That's a good point. I mean, there's you feel free to send information through us because we've got a long reach into our sector, but also know that you can contact a whole range of different community service providers, and probably the best way to do that is through the Victorian Council of Social Service and through their respective networks as well. So you really would get good reach into the mental health, the drug and alcohol, the disability sector, for example, all of which might be services that you wanted to make sure your information was about your family violence provisions were available in.
I would also be sending it out to the banks, the banking sector, because if someone's ringing up with hardship or with family violence regarding their bank accounts, then there may be some crossover with what the financial abuse or other things they need to do with their water and electricity and gas and those things as well.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Alice, did you want to add something? Alice from Alinta to this question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Christy. I guess I've just put this in the chat, but I'll sort of read it out. I guess just further to Samira's point that she made, which is just around that, safety being always the priority with our customers, and if there's any recommendations or advice about how we can advise customers of the kind of support we can provide, I've just said here as well that, at the moment we're finding it very difficult to hear from our customers. So I guess once COVID became prevalent, we, still attempted to contact customers via their, preferred method of communication for a time. And then we found that we weren't getting any engagement and made a call just to cease trying to contact people. Obviously that was, in the interest of protecting their safety and not to jeopardise them in any way. We appreciate that, why there's a lack of engagement and why we're not hearing from these customers, for all the reasons we've been talking about. But what we're concerned about is that, the normal levels of assistance we can provide around, payment plans, hardship, concessions and grants and the like to, help customers keep on top of their arrears and their ongoing usage. Those conversations aren't able to be had right now. So we're just concerned that they're going to fall behind, or it's just going to become another issue for them. So I guess any advice that either the ESC, community sectors, or other retailers or the water business can sort of offer for us to be able to sort of move forward and do something for these customers, that would be fantastic.
One of the things that we do is when we speak to someone is we work out how we can safely contact them again, and sometimes there is no way, but it may be it's safe by email, you're safe to do a text, you can call, but you can only call between 3 and 4, making it clear whether you're going to leave a message or not, so you can have that discussion. Is it okay for me to say I'm from Yarra Valley Water or from Alinta or whatever, or should I never leave a message? And that still won't pick up everyone, but it may pick up some. One of the things I always say with family violence is about robbing people of their power and control. If you can have transparent conversations in which you are putting that power and control and decision making back on the victim, survivor, and give that back, then it increases your ability to engage, whilst also reinforcing a respectful relationship between yourself and the victim survivor.
Yeah, thank you for that, Julie, and that's all really good advice. Just to give you a bit of context, for under our regulatory obligations as retailers, we actually have a requirement, which is understandably so, on us to establish the customer's preferred method of communication, and that's something that we do as soon as we become aware that that customer is experiencing family violence. It's just that in this environment, so say 3 months ago we had a customer who said it's okay to text message me or call me between these hours or whatever it might be, and we would comply, I guess, or follow those instructions. We're finding that when we do that now, we're not getting any response. And, presumably it would be, around the fact that they might be at home with the perpetrator because they're in isolation, because there's working from home, because all these things we've just, I guess, made an assumption on. And as a result of that, that's where we're coming up with some challenges, and we're just not hearing anything from any of our customers, to be quite honest. And that's concerning for us on one hand, because we want to make sure that they're safe, and that level of engagement we normally have with them means that we know what situation they're in, and we know when and when not to contact them. But at the moment, it's almost like those rules have gone out the window, and without any kind of I guess direction or engagement from those customers, where, as I said, validly concerned that if we do attempt any contact with them at the moment, that it could potentially put them in jeopardy. So it's a bit of a rock and the hard place at the moment. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, in a lot of ways.
And Alice, what I would say, it sucks. It absolutely sucks. But one of the things I would keep in mind is, you might be right, you can't contact people, but when people aren't contacting you back because of safety concerns, they're doing what they can to keep themselves safe. That is that victim survivor who is the expert of their situation in that moment is doing what they can to keep them safe. And at that point, they decided that calling you back was too much of a risk. And that's good that they're able to maintain that level of safety and do what they can to keep them safe.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Ali. Sorry to jump in. We're just very mindful of time, and we do want Stephen to go away with his questions. So, Stephen, please say in 30 seconds, and Julie, please 30 seconds response.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for that, Christy. Very quickly, and possibly for Julia and Alison, a lot of the reports going around are that customers actually reaching out to support networks and things like that are down, and because of obviously the lockdown and the social isolation. What I'm curious about is, do you have any strong figures on that? And I know, Alison, you spoke about it shortly, but also the idea, some of the reports I read, was that they would actually see a spike post the lockdown being lifted as people could get more access to resources, get out of the house, get into a safe zone. Do you guys have any views or expectations or sort of projections or anything you're sort of preparing for in your own resourcing and things like that, post knowing that obviously the lockdown may be lifted or eased even this weekend?
Yep. Yeah, thanks. Look, it's actually very hard to tell yet. I mean, we've really only had 8 weeks where we can ascertain any patterns from the data, and it does take time for that to wash through as well, which is why we're sort of tending to rely more on anecdotal data. But I think what we were seeing very early, where we saw a dip in referrals. It's important to remember that before we went into the pandemic, Australia was obviously in the immediate post-bushfire period, and that had, or we think that there'd already been an increase in demand on services, but also the murder of Hannah Clark and her children in Queensland that had really intense media focus. It had a really significant effect, and we saw it because there was so much commentary around family violence at that time. We saw that it drove really significant demand onto the service system, and so we went into this pandemic with really high levels of demand across the whole country, I believe. So where we saw a dip early on, we've actually kind of come to see those numbers leveling out now. So it's really hard to ascertain what's going on from all the formal data, which is why we're kind of tending to rely on kind of keeping abreast of the trends by talking to the direct service delivery agencies.
So do you expect then a spike once this is lifted?
Our best guess is that there will be a surge afterwards. We think that once social isolation is lifted, we will see a surge in increase in demand for support. We've seen that overseas, we've seen it internationally, and we know that from what tends to happen in post-crisis situations as well.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks, Ali and Stephen. I think that was a really important question, and I think that's it is a question that I think is being asked across a range of service environments as well. So I think it's something we are all trying to kind of keep an eye on. I'm also really conscious of time, so I want to say thank you very much, first of all, to our speakers, Alison and Julie. We really appreciate your time today. We really appreciate everyone coming to today's forum, and also just participating in the Menti process and really being engaged. We really appreciate that. We've also got one last question that we didn't get to do, so if you do have time and you want to, feel free to log on to Menti and just go one thing that you're taking away from today's talk. It really helps us, and what we might be able to do when we do a wrap-up email is to share the final picture of all those responses. We'll also send a survey for everyone who's attended today, so please look out for that. And I think that's all the things I had to remember to tell you. Please stay safe and well. Enjoy a little bit of sunshine from where I can see. So we're really committed to kind of supporting this sort of work at the Commission. As Kat mentioned, we're working on this vulnerability project as well. So we've got the community roundtables every couple of weeks. We're really keen to speak to you and to hear what's happening on the ground for you. So really appreciate your time today, and thanks. Have a nice afternoon.